we have a program with Glenn Corbett on the National Civil War Wax Museum. And I don't know, probably many of you spend time in the Wax Museum. And I was there when I was a kid, and I worked for them for a little while, so I spent a lot of time in the Wax Museum, and I'm very excited to hear what Glenn has to tell us. So without further ado, Glenn Corbett.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. So thank you very much. I want to thank everybody here at the Adams County Historical Society, particularly Tim, Michaela, Andrew. Just a wonderful facility here. I actually live in Bergen County, North Jersey. So my regular W-2 is I'm a college professor in New York City at John Jay College on 59th Street. So I teach fire science, emergency management, and public management. So I've been there. I'm going to probably retire in a couple of years. And that stuff has nothing to do with this. So you're wondering how the heck why are we here today talking about wax figures? Like you, we're all interested in history, and one thing that always intrigued me was these wax museums. When we went to different places when I was a kid and growing up and things, and it just fascinated me. And and as time went on, I said, you know what? They're starting to disappear, and they're sort of falling off the landscape. And I went ahead and started digging down a little more deeply, and was able to connect some people that were very much involved with a lot of them across the country. And one particular operator of museums, wax museums, was the Dorfman. Eventually became Dorfman family. Developed and ran several of them across the country, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'll mention some of those others in a little while. So we're going to cover a lot here. I got like 200 slides, but we're going to go real quick through them. So we're going to talk real briefly about history of Wax Museum in general. These particular people, Earl Dorfman and Frank Dennis, their wax figures, National Historical Wax Museum in Washington, some of you may have been to. And again, get right into the Civil War Wax Museum in terms of development and opening. We'll take a tour of the museum, what it looked like when it first opened, through the years. When they closed it, they had the auction, and then, of course, its transformation into what's now the Gettysburg Heritage Center. Wax figures have been around for thousands of years. The modern ones sort of came around in the 18th century, so the 1700s. And one of the whole points of this was that, Madame Tussauds created her first figure of Voltaire in France in 1777. There's a whole story about that, you could read about. But one of the reasons why wax museums became popular, and wax museums not only in fixed installations, fixed buildings, but also traveling wax museums that went from town to town to town, including here to Gettysburg in 1801, a series of wax figures came here. I don't know much more about it. It's in the newspaper, but it was here. But the reason why they were really, I guess, attractive to a lot of people is that, we don't get sketches in newspapers or, common books until the later 19th century, right? We don't get photography in a lot of these things until late 19th century and then early 20th century. So a lot of people had no idea with what the King of England looked like, even though they were subject over there or whatever. They had no idea what these people looked like. So this is a way for people to see, gee, that's what King George III looks like, or that's who that person looks like. And so by the late 19th century, there's more gaining popularity in them. And then we start to have in the United States more fixed, wax museums that are focused just on that and not other kind of museums that have other stuff. So one of the first big ones was the Eden Musée in New York City. If you watch the House of Wax with Vincent Price, that's what they're mimicking as that particular museum of that era, okay? This is the key guide to all this today, Earl Dorfman. He's originally from New York City, graduated from the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. He studied commercial art and architecture. So he is a key guide to everything we're going to see today. He actually ended up in the department store business, not working for department stores in general, but he did work for Hecht as one of their display managers. So he was interested in window displays. And of course, coming from New York City, you know, back then, of course, even then, Christmas time was incredible, right? So he had to sort of grew up in that kind of environment where window displays are really important. And he ended up working for what's called the Dorothy Lynch Display Corporation as a designer in Baltimore, and that's where he landed in Baltimore. And eventually he buys the company. Here he is. Okay, this is a few years after he's obviously been creating some figures. He's a really funny guy too, by the way, really funny. And we'll hear some funny stories about him. Here's a picture actually of Dorothy Lynch. This is pretty rare. I found this, again, where all things good come from eBay, okay? With a press photo of her. She's the one who started the display company in Pittsburgh that eventually moved to Baltimore and then ended up with these two fellows working for her, Victor Sakharov and Earl. You could see on the figures there with the names, basically. Maybe it's backwards, actually. I'm not sure. But anyway, I think one's Hamilton. Hamilton and Burr. That's what it is. Hamilton and Burr, the middle figures there on the left. Frank Dennis. Who the heck is this guy? Frank Dennis was originally from Oklahoma. He graduated from Harvard Law School. He worked for the U.S. Government Information Agency way back in the day. He was a news reporter. He actually ended up becoming a later editor, one of the editors of the Washington Post. And so how the heck does he connect to this thing? Well, here's Frank. He is now a judge at the Salem witch trials, right? That's what he is. That's him. Okay, and what you're going to find out that's really important here, if you own the Wax Museum or you're involved with it, you get your figure in the museum itself, okay, which is pretty funny. So that's one actually from the Washington Wax Museum, which was their very first. So how did this come about? Well, Frank is in Paris on a trip with his family. His neighbors are there with him. The neighbors are Richard Riddles and his family. They're traveling through. They go to the Musée Grevin in Paris, which is their signature wax museum, and like Tussauds is for London. And they're enthralled with it. They go, we don't have anything like this in the United States. We need to have a wax museum here. And we need one that focuses on American history. That would be really cool. So they start to develop it in 1955. And they figure out we need some help. Let's get a guy who designs window displays that can help us, like put not the figures yet, but put the arrangements of the backgrounds and the diorama, put all that together for us. And along the way, there's a conversation between Earl Dorfman and Frank Dennis. And Earl Dorfman says, hey, I deal with mannequins all the time. That's my life, working for Dorothy Lynch, and we make figures for department stores. How about if I make a new one for you, but it's much more detailed, and we're not going to make it out of wax, though. We're going to make it out of plastic. So we call this the Civil War Wax Museum, but they're actually plastic. They are not wax, okay? And the reason for that, as you can imagine, is because they're a little bit more durable. They hold up a little better. But they give you a very similar kind of effect, basically, in terms of the features on the face and things like that. So Earl says, you know what? I'm gonna do a sample one for you of Lincoln. So he does that. He actually makes a sitting Lincoln. Again, he's an artist to some extent, so he makes this Lincoln. He has a couple friends who are sculptors. They put this Lincoln figure together. They put it in Frank Dennis's second floor office in his house, and people come in. They bring them upstairs. Oh, we're thinking about a wax museum. Why don't you come upstairs and see one of the figures we're thinking about putting in there? That was a way to sell and getting investment money for people that saw the figure. Like, wow, this is really cool. So it all started with a Lincoln figure in Washington, D.C. on the second floor of Frank Dennis's house. That's where all this started. And so Dorfman then started with him, not just to do the sets and the design of the sets, but also to do the figures themselves. And that's how we kind of know him. How did he come up with the plastic on his Earl Dorfman made the plastic at home in his kitchen. He was trying different materials of plastic that was moldable, and they tried the different tints to it. I mean, did all these kind of things. So that's how it sort of came about. There is the first museum for Dorfman and for Frank Dennis. It's the National Historical Wax Museum in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you noticed there. Do you see up in the corner there of the building on the photo on the right, the corner, you see that horse's head? That was a brewery stable building. And they were in there for a few years. And then what happened? The government showed up and they said, oh, we want to build a center. We're going to call it the Kennedy Center. And so they had to move out. So this museum moved through Washington a few times. The first is they were booted out for the Kennedy Center. So that's where that was. And there's a one of the earlier brochures for it. And what's key to this brochure is a couple things. Notice the word wax works, not wax museum, okay? The wax works was an old term from Tussaud's era and stuff, so they were still kind of talking that way. But even more important was, what does it say? America's finest, air conditioned. That was the selling point. You can go and it's cool inside, right? That was the whole thing. Now, who's this guy? Richard Riddle. He's a real estate entrepreneur. That's it's Frank Dennis's neighbor, real estate entrepreneur, involved in all sorts of stuff along those lines. He later became the president of the Civil War Wax Museum. And the other person that's involved here is a guy by the name of Chaim Uberman, who was a big gift shop and souvenir businessman and investor. So it was a group of 5 people that created the Civil War Wax Museum. It started out of Washington, though, out of that museum. So that's how Uberman apparently came to Washington and ran the gift shop in that Washington museum. And then when this talk about another museum in Gettysburg, oh, I want to be part of that. And that's kind of how he got, and of course, he plays a role with the museum in later years. Earl Dorfman created the Wax Museum frenzy of the 60s, 70s, and a little bit of the 80s, because their wax museum, the Dorfman-related wax museum, aren't the only ones in this country. Louis Tussaud, they stole his name and used they have a series of museums. The Movie Land Wax Museum in California in the 60s, they all came after the one in Washington. And so in a way, we can credit Earl Dorfman and his capabilities, his artistic prowess to sort of create all these things. So here's a list of the ones he did. Okay, there's Washington on the top, Civil War here. John Brown only closed, a couple years ago on Harper's Ferry, right? That was Harper's Ferry, John Brown, and Civil War Wax Museum lasted about the same amount of time, about 50 years. Because Harper's Ferry came a few years later after Civil War did. Maybe you were in that one there. They built the Wax Museum in Denver. And again, the key points, these are all historical. They are not chamber horrors, not crazy stuff, not movie stars, none of that stuff. None of that is in here, okay? It's all historical. Williamsburg, which actually, that's where he came from, that fellow over there. And we'll explain why he came from Williamsburg to move to Gettysburg, and he's in the Appomattox scene. I'll explain that in a little while. Some of you may have been to Lancaster. There's a wax museum there. The man who built Dutch Wonderland built this one with Earl Dorfman. And he also did Weavertown, the Weavertown Schoolhouse. That only closed several years ago. We'll see a couple pictures of that. Gatlinburg, American Historical, Naval in Annapolis. That didn't last too long. It's probably one of the shortest one was in the Naval one in Annapolis. Did Tim Smith go there as a kid? Did you go to the Naval Historical Wax Museum in Annapolis? Okay, so you were there. It was a short window. It was only about 8 or 9 years, that one. Pioneer Square out in Seattle, Plymouth. We'll see a couple figures in the background from Plymouth. A Museum of Famous People. At some point in the 70s, they decided that the word wax museum was maybe not the right word to use. So they built a wax museum called the Museum of Famous People in New York City, right there in Rockefeller Center. It was actually in the basement of, I forgot, 3 Rock or one of those buildings there. The Myrtle Beach Wax Museum, and this is where the exception to the rule applies. This is built in the 80s, and so the period of interest in historical wax museum is starting to go down, right? The people are not as interested anymore. So what did they do there? And I know the Dorfmans were really complexed and really conflicted about, is the word I'm looking for, conflicted about this, but they put a Chamber of Horrors in the Myrtle Beach Wax Museum. And I know they did it dragging and screaming because they didn't want to do it. They want to keep so they had both the historical part and the other because they realized they needed to bring people in to pay for it, right? Because they had their investment. And the last one they did was Natural Bridge, and they owned that museum outright. Most of these museums were in partnerships with various people, local people, like the fellow who who owned Hilltop, the Hilltop Resort in Harpers Ferry. He's the one who funded the Harpers Ferry John Brown Wax Museum. So, and again, the fellow who owned Dutch Wonderland, he's the one who had Dorfman come in, and they were investors on that as well. By the way, why is there a picture of Lion's Den here, okay? If you're a wax figure, where do you go to live out the rest of your existence? You go to Mansfield, Ohio, to a Bible Walk Wax Museum where they've collected figures from all over the country and repurposed them as religious figures. So there are figures from the Civil War Wax Museum that are now religious, and they're living in Mansfield, Ohio now. So anyway, they are the biggest wax museum in the country now. They have over, I think, 400 or 500 figures out there now. But they came from all these closing wax museums, and this pastor was into wax museums. He created this whole thing. It's incredibly impressive if you're ever out that way to go see it. It's run by a local church, too. I mean, it's unbelievable. Okay, so we're getting into design now. Here's the announcement in the Gettysburg Times of the incorporation. Notice that they want to be able to do a bunch of things: to acquire and operate a wax museum, to publish, deal in maps, postal cards, magazine, newspapers, and other public. It's all about the souvenirs here, my friend. That's what drives a lot of this stuff, right? Acquire, maintain motels, hotels, inns, restaurants, sandwich shops. They could do all these things. Cigarettes, tobacco products, drugs, souvenirs, novelties. One thing that wasn't on the list, but they did get approval for, was a photo booth in the wax museum. I don't know that it ever got installed, but it was in the paper that they tried to do that too. And here's the big one. This is the one that Tim probably is well aware of, that the Harry and Jeanette Wright sell their property to the wax museum people on Tonytown Road. And it freaks people out because at that moment in time, the federal government is, this is the period of time now. We're talking, again, early 60s. I'm sorry, I didn't put the date up here, but we're talking 1960, 61, when all this is happening now. They, the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association, they're trying to save parts of, by the, Devil's Den and up here, right over here on Mumsburg Road. Anyway, there's another piece over here near Hunt Avenue that they really wanted, but the Wax Museum people came in and bought it from the Wrights. And for how much? $45,000, okay? So that's the point, right? There's the article. Battlefield area lost to Wax Museum. Oh, that's really bad. So what happens? Well, the U.S. government, how often did this happen? The U.S. government got a bill passed somehow in some, I'm sure, some omnibus bill, some tack on, whatever. The money came forward from the federal government for that particular piece of property, which ironically, we'll talk about later, where the Gettysburg Visitor Center ended up is right over there. So that had a role with this of buying that particular piece of property there. So now the Wax Museum people are like, where do we go now? They made $10,000. The government gave them $10,000 more than they paid for it, okay? So they paid $45,000. You saw before. The federal government gave them $55,000 for that piece of property. But where do we go now? Where is the new museum going to be? Now we go to Steinwehr, and we end up buying for $130,000 for a particular piece of property. I forgot to put this in my presentation, but I did some deed research when I was doing the Charlie Weaver talk a while back. And while I was in there, I looked this up, and it's a very complex piece of property. There's 4 different owners, including the Gettysburg Construction Company, which I assume was the company that built most of Colt Park, I would think. And they owned that. So the Wax Museum guys had to buy it. And they have, over time, Mr. Riddle, we talked about before, bought all the way down the block to Euler's Garage. That was like the last piece that they got. Now, this is a pretty rare photograph here. This, again, all good things come from eBay, okay? This is a photo that, I don't know why they took it. I mean, other than the Howard Johnson's that's across the street there. But what it shows you on the right is the vacant piece of property that hasn't been built with the Wax Museum yet. So this is 1961, I think, is the date on it, when it was developed, the slide. And so I grabbed it because I knew exactly what I was looking at there. So that's the vacant piece of property. I think there's even a willow tree on the right there, if you could see it very far into the picture there. I threw this in one because I wanted to know what you thought about what the interior of a Howard Johnson looked like in 1962. That was it. That was it. I have to believe that Earl Dorfman and the team that built the museum were staying at that hotel. I have to believe it, because it's right next door. I can't imagine they would go to the Gettysburg Hotel or somewhere else. Had to be that. All right, here's another guy I'm going to bring up now, Robert Dorfman. He's the fellow that I know. Robert is Earl's son. Robert becomes the owner of Dorfman, what's now called Dorfman Museum Figures. And he's a super nice guy. And he sees a crazy guy like me from New Jersey, a college professor who's interested of all this old stuff about wax museums. And I'm talking to him, he's sharing information with me, and it gets to the point, he said, Glenn, you like this stuff more than we really needed. So he gave me his entire archive, not just for this museum, but for all the museums, a lot that were on that list before. So they all now reside in Waldeck, New Jersey now. So I really appreciate it. I invited him to the talk today, and he wasn't able to come. I also invited a museum figure. Anybody from there? No. Okay. I invited them as well if they wanted to come up, because they're based in Baltimore. They're on Holabird Street in Baltimore. And they're still there. They still make figures today, not so much for wax museums per se, because there's no more wax museums other than Tussauds. They actually make figures. Primarily they make conservation figures for clothing, like here in this museum. So we had dresses and stuff. They're the ones who make all these figures to hold the dresses and, for display or whatever they need to do it for. But they still have, it's close to 1,000 heads that they can make for you. So if anyone in this room wants to have a wax figure of their own, they just go down to Holabird Street, right? They go in the front door, they knock on the door, say, hey, I need a figure of Glenn Corbett. I need a figure of Tim Smith. If they have that head, they will make it for you. They'll form it, they'll put a figure together, and you could have it in your house if you want to. So if you want a famous person like General Reynolds here, there's a Reynolds head in that whole set of molds there, right there. So they have them all, right? So that's still in existence today. But Robert, you see why they did this. He goes to conventions of trade shows for museums and stuff, so they would bring along the figure, okay? I didn't include the one photograph they had him as a breather. There's always at least one breather in every Dorfman museum, okay? Does anybody know which the breather was in Gettysburg? Anybody know who the breather was there? He's being attacked by Preston Brooks. Anybody know who that was? Yes, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. He's within an inch of his death, apparently. He was out of the Senate for 3 years after he was almost caned to death. That's the famous caning scene. So if you watched that scene, his chest was moving. If you were in the John Brown Wax Museum in Harper's Ferry, the African-American figure at the train station attack, he's the breather in that museum. Although they have John Brown at the end, it's very freaky. John Brown, the big final scene is John Brown walking up the gallows, and they have a whole narration. And as soon as they get to the end, they start playing the Ballad of the Republic and stuff. The head slowly turns and looks at you, looking at him. So it's really freaky, okay? So, but that's the point. It's to make it a little bit more exciting, right? All right, this is part of that archive. This is part of the archive. I have brought a bunch of things today with me, bits and pieces of stuff I thought you might like to see. That is the actual spreadsheet for Gettysburg. So when you're building a wax museum, you got to keep track of a lot of things. You got to figure out who are going to put in there, what clothing are they going to wear, who's going to sculpt their head, who's going to do this and do that. And so that's all what this is. And so we're going to zero in on a couple here. So the Southern Plantation. Oh boy, look who got in there, Mr. Riddle and Mrs. Riddle. So that first scene inside the Gettysburg Wax Museum, we'll see in a second here, of the two people in the cart at a cotton plantation, two people in that carriage, that's the Riddles. That's one of the investors here. He's the finance guy and the real estate guy here. The slaves, you can see Carver. They repurposed Carver, the Carver figure they had, for that. So what they did over the years is, like, for example, in Plymouth, Elizabeth Taylor, I don't know why she ended up in their collection. Elizabeth Taylor was Priscilla Mullins at the Plymouth Wax Museum, okay? So they would have specific famous people embedded in there, okay, that you wouldn't even realize that's them. Who's the Dennises? They're the Northern factory workers, okay? Mr. and Mrs. Dennis there. The Cotton Gin, Eli Whitney. And you could see there's a lot of cross out. This is while Dorfman is actually figuring out who he's going to put in here. Henry Clay, Calhoun, Webster, Andrew Jackson, Harriet Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison, Robert Rhett, and Thomas Benton. We'll see that in a minute because we're going to take a tour here in a second. I'll explain a little more about those. There's your caning of Sumner, right? By the way, Charlie Sumner lives in Waldwick, New Jersey now. I didn't bring him because he's a little bit more delicate. I have not gotten him back working again, breathing yet. But he's also amongst these figures at my house. John Brown and Gallows, I want to point out here, what's it say? Wore red felt slippers to the gallows. You know, at the end of the day, my cousin here, by the way, he's my assistant, my handler, and my friends here. He helps me every time we come and do these things. He's been a collector for a million years of military stuff, and of course, what's on a lot of these figures is not exactly correct, right? So there's some these are enlisted man buttons on here. Okay, all right. So, but they tried to do things as close as they could, and we'll see you'll see him in the picture in a little while here. So the red felt, remember red felt. Dred Scott decision, there's Tawney and Scott. Okay, now that's along one side of the spreadsheet. Along the top, who's doing the research? What clothing did they wear? Did they look like? Because there's a lot of these people in these museums, they have no idea. When you start going back to Plymouth, we don't know what William Brewster looked like exactly. Sort of. We sort of know. So they had to do all that research in the 1950s and 60s when there's no internet or any of that stuff to Google to look things up. So it's really kind of hard. So here's your sculptors along the top. Those are the three key guys. You'll see them in a minute. Then there was a molder. Then there was the person that made the mold itself. And then there was the caster. That's the person who actually made the head after the mold was made. And then the hands, you can imagine, they did the same thing. The body was Berg, and along with Victor, and Bergman was the wig, and Victor Victor was the fellow you saw that was one of the owners of the Dorfman. Okay, so they're all involved making things here. And who else was making stuff but Robert Dorfman? He told me a story. I said, "What do you know about Gettysburg Wax Museum?" He says, he was a kid. He was like 8 or 9 years old. His father was still developing the business in 1960, 61. They didn't have a big operation yet. So a lot of stuff was made in his basement. And so Robert Dorfman told me he was tortured for weeks on end making all the shoes for the Pickett's charge scene at Gettysburg. He made them himself, okay, and I forgot the name of that plastic compound. You can mold it, and then he painted them and stuff like that. Because if you got 50, 75, 100 figures in a display, how much would it cost you to buy shoes for every one of them? A lot of money. So it was easier just to make effectively fake shoes. Okay, stored and build. So this is Dorothy Lynch. That's still the name of the company at that point. He is basically selling the figures back to his other investors for the actual museum itself to keep track of all the money here is being spent. Okay, I'll go through a few more. Here's Clara Barton and Antietam. Okay, Wounded Soldier. It plays a role with this guy here, and I'll tell you why. Tim was asking me why he's missing his feet and stuff, and that plays a role here. The wounding of Stonewall Jackson, and some more. Here's the military leaders, Mosby. Here's Custer, Emancipation Proclamation. Here's the final scene, the battle scene, which, by the way, Dorfman, for every single museum he did a signature end of the museum exhibit, okay? In our case, it was the biggest one he ever did, as far as I know, even bigger than Washington. It was the biggest one, had the most figures in it, but every one of them had, like, again, the gallows scene. They had the Alamo at Denver, so they had a bunch of things. And you see the lettering system, that's important for us too, because I got to keep track of a lot of people here. But here's the one for Tim up on top. Look what's up there, Barbara Frecci, okay? Originally, Barbara was supposed to be in the Gettysburg Wax Museum. But thank God she was replaced by Tim's favorite, Jenny Wade, okay? She made it into the museum. Barbara Frecci didn't. But you'll see in a brochure that they thought Barbara was going to be in there, and they took her out. And all I can imagine, and the reason they did that, like, for example, in Gatlinburg, that museum, they put Sergeant York in there because it was a local person that was famous, right? So that's why they purposely tried to bring local people in. Oh, I know, I've heard of Jenny Wade, or I've heard of her. Barbara Fritchie, yeah, but of course it's a mucky area, and probably Tim knows a lot more about this, about Barbara Fritchie and that story about the poem that was written. It was really her, it was somebody else, and what was said by Stonewall Jackson, was that right or not, or the whole bit. So, but again, notice all the lettering and stuff, because that does play a role. Then we had the display. That was one set. There's another set of things that tells you exactly what each set. How many chairs do I need? Do I need a tree? Do I need whatever? So this is how they keep track of this. Again, this is 1960-61 that we're doing this. This is the original sketch that's in there for the layout of the museum. There's the main entrance. There's the turnstile up in the top right. You see it there? Turnstile, right, top right. Okay, so this main entrance coming in that way. There's the door out the back. There's 3 doors in the back of that building. That's the one that you see on the far right, okay? But there's, and what you would do, and you'll see here in a minute on the program, this map, it's basically identical to this. They made some changes. See, they moved some walls because they needed more space for something, what have you. This is an original sketch. I brought it with me of one of the scenes we'll see here in a minute. That's how did the design of the thing actually get done? Well, the design of the displays. They started with a sketch like that. It was a very rough sketch, just like how many figures, what's the overall look. This is an outdoor encampment of Confederate officers. They got a stove on the side there. That's the theory. That's what they wanted. So this is not the final drawing. Obviously, this is the very first drawing for that. Here's another one for the Slidell thing, and this is one that moved. Dorfman loved a little bit of, not so much animatronics, so we'll talk about that, but more animated stuff. So this boat sort of shifted a little bit too, as they tell the story of Slidell and the Trenton and things like that. Again, this, and notice, by the way, they put where the feet go on the stairs too. Okay, this is very this is detailed, so that they all know what we're dealing with here. There's a sketch for the famous Fort Sumter scene. Now, this one's unusual because Dorfman also did another thing. He had 2 scenes in one, right? So he had the Fort Sumter officers in the front, and then you can see the cannon, but it's through a screen in the back. So they did lighting to bring up, they brought up the lighting in the front, and as they moved toward the attack, they took the lighting down the front, and they lit up the back through the screen so you could see the guy inside the garrison there ready to fire the cannon stuff. So he liked to try to not just make them all static figures, but try to incorporate different things. Here's the Farragut scene. This guy becomes famous. He also lives in Waldwick, not Farragut, but the guy to the right. And you'll see him in a little while, my cousin. Then you had to have architectural drawings, basically what they wanted the displays themselves to look like for the architect to build it. The fellow was here earlier, works for the Adams County Historical Society. His father was a carpenter that worked on this building. I'm sure he would have seen some of these plans here. Some more. I think that's the Maximilian exhibit. Some more. There's the. I brought that one. That's the Lincoln exhibit. We'll see here. Okay. Now, this is not Gettysburg, because what I do not have is this kind of sketch for this museum. There's certain things that are missing that I don't have, and that's one of them. Notice that every figure has a letter above it. That's to say what's the panorama. This is the signature. This is the signature scene for Plymouth, Massachusetts, and of course, what is the landing on Plymouth Rock. That shallop that's out in the water is doing this because there's real water in there. It's going up and down, and the figure's doing this back and forth. So the guy with his hand out, letter K there, he also lives in Waldwick, New Jersey now. Okay, I picked him because I said that's a more focal point figure. I wanted him. Now, how does Plymouth connect a little bit to Gettysburg? Is this. If you were at my Charlie Weaver talk, this is from that talk as well, but this is Plymouth. And the guy on the left, that's Leroy Smith, okay? Because Leroy Smith was part owner of the Plymouth Wax Museum with Dorfman, okay? And he was friends with Earl, and they were, of course, very close to Cliff Arquette. So anyway, I wanted to show you that's what it looks like. So each figure would have a letter, so they knew exactly where each one of them went. Here's a couple of the, there's Burge on the right, and Peloso on the left. Again, they're not making necessarily Civil War figures here. These are working on other figures. I don't know who this fellow's name is, but that's the molding operation there, because there's the mold, and there's the head coming out after it's been. Look at the detail on that. It's pretty impressive. Then we've got folks who work on the arms and legs, who use paint and stuff to give a little tint and things like that. Then we've got, of course, the ladies who work on the wigs, okay? Of course, there's Lady Bird. Oh my gosh, Lady Bird Johnson, okay, she's in there too. That was in the Washington Wax Museum. This is actually from the Heritage Center, their collection. They actually have a small collection of stuff when the building was first built. I don't know who he is, but I'm pretty sure you can see the Civil War officers in the back there. I don't know if this was Burnside or not. I don't remember which one this is, but you can see them. He's, of course, this is a press photo. He's trying to show what the kind of work that they do. And of course, we have to have makeup. So we have a lady that does that in the museum or at the Dorfman facility for Ben Franklin. This is Nathaniel Parker. Nathaniel Parker is the guy who does all the mechanical breathers, okay? I met him. He's now retired, but he's the one who built every single one of them, okay? Here's the old, I put this one in because I wanted to show you what the original museums kind of look like that they developed. This is the Washington one. There's Mrs. Dennis on the right next to Grant, okay? Now, do you think they had to make another whole rendering of Grant and Lee for this museum? No, they went back to the original molds that they made for the Washington one and just recast them again. That's all they do. So they try to use as many old ones, particularly for non-well-known people. Okay, I brought this along. This is unique because this is the only museum in the system where I found, this is like a set of caricatures that I think, and I don't know, I haven't heard back from Bob Dorfman yet, who did the original sketches. I think this is the same guy. He must have came with them here to help build the museum because there's all little scenes here, and I'll pull up a couple. Poor Gene, taking a coffee break at 3 a.m., so I must have been working all night long on this, and I see that his car is sitting on a railroad track, so something must have happened here while they were building it. I don't know. Where did they go to eat? The lamppost, okay, that's where they went to eat. There's a little four risque ones in here, which I did not include in the small shots. Clem's end, he's the electrician, and you can see he's like being electrified, all the wires and stuff, okay? Smitty was this, again, I don't know who he's referring to here, but Smitty was the one who did all the scene drapes and stuff like that. And here's Earl himself. Lighting and Earl go together. A big thing about wax museums is lighting and darkness, right? That's the key, right? It's not all well lit. You have the dark corridor with a lit scene to focus your attention on that, and he was really good at it. And the man who did this is John Emeril. And it's done in this case, and done in 62. So this is while they were building it, basically. Okay, this is the only photo I have under construction. That was out of the newspaper. It went up really quick once they got the piece of property. This is interesting. I don't know if Tim's got both of these folders, these brochures. Notice the date on the one on the left and the date on the one on the right. The one says March 1st opening. The one on the right says April opening, right? Because they probably missed their due date. So these would have been brochures that went out 6 months, a year before. Oh, we're bringing a wax museum to Gettysburg. They had planned on being at March 1st, but it didn't quite make it. Here's some inside, and again, it's a little bit rough to read, but Barbara Fritchie's in the middle of that list on the right there, so she never made it here, okay? Jenny did. Okay. Here's the back side of it. A little point here. Notice the location to the electric map. That was really important, and that becomes an issue many years later that we'll see, where they are in relationship to other stuff. Okay, here's the announcement in the newspaper. Welcome, free admission, more than 150 figures. Here's the opening article in the newspaper. It actually did open on April 1962. This is in the collection of the Gettysburg Heritage Center. This is really cool. I think that's Oberman, the father. Is it? Yes. All right, thank you. Then you confirmed it for me. I couldn't guess because there was nobody else I knew, and it had to be him because of the gift store and stuff like that, right? Okay. So guess what that is? It's a cake somebody made in the form of the wax museum. It's pretty cool, isn't it? That's a really well-detailed cake there, isn't it? So thank you for confirming that. Do you know who the ladies are? One must be his wife, maybe. I don't know. Okay. But, yeah. Okay. Okay. I took a wild guess that it was him, but because I didn't know what he looked like because I can't find a picture of him online. So they also have at the collection of the Gettysburg Historical Society, they had Walter Lane come in to take photographs of every exhibit, professional photograph. Earl Dorfman did that for every single museum. I have the set for Plymouth. They have the set for Gettysburg, and that's the Stonewall Jackson scene there. This is a picture, again, off of eBay that I got. Notice that it's missing the cannons here, so this has got to be really early. It's probably right after they opened. It's not a great picture, but it's an early one. Okay, here's the layout. Again, the blue line. Okay, so where you're starting over there, we saw earlier. You work your way back and forth, and when the blue line goes down, it's going to be going into the battlefield room. They changed out, and you'll see here because we're going to take a tour of this. Okay, this is actually out of the program here. There are the riddles. Okay, there's the riddles. The financier guy and the real estate guy. There's he and his wife. That's them. Then we had the Industrial North. Okay, that's it. Frank Dennis and his wife, I think, is the one at the iron, I think. But that's Frank Dennis over there looking at a piece of cloth, right? So they're trying to tell the story of how the Civil War developed. I mean, remember, the key thing about this museum is not Gettysburg in the sense that it's all about Gettysburg. It's about the whole Civil War, which Gettysburg plays a role. There's the cotton gin. What you'll notice here also, look at the one before, sort of a very elaborate background. A lot of them were more drapes, like you saw in the Washington Museum where they were setting it up, the woman with the broom, right? It's much more like that. Even Charles Sumner here and Preston Brooks, the only illustration had was the Capitol interior there. So that did change over time when Tim actually was closer, when Tim was involved with them. Here's a series of figures that were in the museum originally that were all taken out. These are the great triumvirate, right, of the pre-Civil War days. Henry Clay, I think it's a pretty good image of him. John C. Calhoun, okay, and Daniel Webster. Those are the triumvirate in Congress, okay, slavery versus non-slavery, all those kind of things. And so they were represented there. Andrew Jackson, okay. Harry Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? William Lloyd Garrison, the big abolitionist, right? He's in there. Robert Rhett, the fire eater from South Carolina that was supposedly the man considered the most to be responsible for the Civil War is that guy right there, politically, of moving it in that direction. So I guess we can argue that one. Thomas Benton, okay. These are all key players right up to the Civil War. And that's what they were trying to do is show what these people look like and tell a little story. Because remember, the Wax Museum, the panels with each one are very short. They're a sentence, at most 2 sentences. The whole point is that I can walk from thing to thing and take a little bit away, a little bit away, a little bit away, right? What's he wearing? There you go, okay? That gallows scene did change later on. You'll see he actually ended up in front of a building, like not being hanged, but coming out of a house, like with the little child, the famous image of that. Again, look at the background here with Dred Scott and Roger Taney. Okay, I've got the blueprint for that one over here. That's the Knox exhibit. There's Douglas with the debating Lincoln on the right. Whoops, uh-oh. Here we go. And here's that scene. Again, remember I told you that they had the figures in the front, and then the lighting would go down, and the figure in the back would then come up. So as they changed the conversation of the recording, not every exhibit had a recording, but a lot did. Okay, the Southern wartime leaders, Northern wartime leaders. Here's how Jackson gets his nickname. Oh, there's the stone wall. Okay, that's how we did it. Okay, remember, dealing with a space that's like not even wide as this platform here, right? So they got a lot to cover in one little area, so they do their best. Monitor Merrimack, okay, the design of Erickson and his design. Slidell, this is another one that the boat had a motor, or the boat mock-up had a little motor on it to make it move a little bit, so it looked like they're on the water, okay? It's a Slidell. Of course, that was the case of the Trent, where the Confederacy sent a couple emissaries over to England and to France to try to have them come into the war for the Confederacy. And of course, they got caught along the way by the U.S. Navy and what have you. So you know that story. Maximilian, okay, that whole deal about France coming into Mexico, because they wanted to show all these different things that were happening. Of course, there she is, the famed Jenny Wade. We'll see her in a little while again. But there she is, a very simple scene in the back with a drapery, her dough tray, and a little stove over there, okay? Northern military officers out in the field here. William Saunders, they had a special event. Well, we'll see that later. He had a special event from here because he was also the organizer, or one of the organizers of the Grange, right? So, and of course, he was the designer of the cemetery here at Gettysburg. That's the sketch I just showed you before. Remember with the stove outside and the Confederate officers in there? That's what it ended up being after that initial sketch. Rose Greenhow, we got a couple spies working for the Confederacy. She's one of them. Look, she looks very spyish, doesn't she? Holding the door open. Belle Boyd, she pulls a gun on this poor guy who had a carbine, somehow ended up on the floor. Why the carbine was in his hand and he was shooting her, I don't know. But, you know, she was very friendly to him, and the little child, or the one, actually it's her mother, no, I guess it's a child, freaked out with the mouth open like that, right? Here's how Clara Barton. Remember that scene, remember that guy at the end. Just remember what that is, and it relates to him. There's Farragut, okay? That one also moved, I believe, and the guy on the right there is, Kurt and I call him the Screamer, because he lives in Waldeck, New Jersey also now. And you'll see him in a little while again. Here's Stonewall's demise in Chancellorsville. And there's actually, if you remember, there was a Jesus figure behind there to pull the religious part of this into the, and again, it was one of those fade in, fade out kind of things. Southern military officers here again, because he had to cover a lot of these people, all these names, all the officers and stuff, so they split them up into a few. There's Custer up, standing up on the left. Emancipation Proclamation, okay, that's the one that was changed pretty dramatically after the movie Glory came out. They added several more figures. Here's Appomattox, of course, a fairly simple one. Again, they would have just replicated the figures from Washington, D.C. You'll see Grant later because he also lives in Waldeck, New Jersey now. Here's the famous scene. This is probably the most popular scene of all Dorfman's museums across the country. It was one that he included in most of them, is the Wilkes Booth assassination of Lincoln. Now here's the battle room. This gets a little complicated here. The battle room is still the largest room in the museum. It has the most figures in it, and it was attempting to cover a lot of different things. So this is actually Pickett, Lee, and Longstreet talking about Pickett's charge, okay? This is supposed to be Warren up on top of Little Round Top. And, of course, there's the angle and Pickett's charge itself. Now, what's going on in the background there, where all the landscape is there, that's where they had a slideshow originally, okay? They had a slideshow to talk, because you sit in that theater, as you do today, you sit in there for a while and it tells you a story. Well, before they had the videos and before everything else, that's what they had. The big ending of the whole thing was this guy here. Whoop, no, not that guy. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. This is from a slide. I wanted to show you a couple more views of this. Now, notice Warren has got a gun here. Now he's got a saber here, okay? Those slides were taken not long after it opened, so they must have changed it up a little bit, okay? I wanted this slide in here because there is Reynolds on the ground there, okay? Wearing a campaign hat. And if you notice if you look carefully around, there's a round circle underneath the bodies there, because that was the one that they all turned when the narration came up to the point where they're talking about the death of Reynolds right across the street over here. That particular scene started to turn around so you could see all sides of it. They did that also for our friend Dan Sickles, we'll see here in a second. Here's another shot of the three of them planning Pickett's charge. There's the Sickles scene. Okay, that also was on a turntable, basically. And, of course, this was the final scene, was the platform actually came up out of the floor. And behind those soldiers on the top, it actually came up from behind. Not unlike if you've ever been to Disney World, to Epcot, during the American Adventure, they have a similar kind of thing. Things come up from down below or they come across. That was kind of what he was doing in 1962, okay, to try to do that. So there's Lincoln. And Lincoln is a static figure. He's talking, but it's static. It doesn't move. It's just static. So here's some pictures. Now we're going to go through these. I'm going to go through these really quickly because I know I'm running out of time here. This is a pretty early shot. Now you can see the cannons are in place now, And it looks pretty nice. There's nice benches out there. There's a nice lady relaxing on the bench out front. There's one of the cannons. Okay, these are all from the 60s. Notice the Quality Inn hotel across the street, right? Another shot. Notice there's no Elby's Big Boy or Shoney's. It's not there yet. And neither is was it Appalachian now? The brewery there? That's there now, a big restaurant there. Okay, a couple more shots. Okay. A couple more shots. Now, what happens? They have their first Christmas party. A lot of places did that back then. So they had a nice Christmas party for all the employees here. There were 27 people working there at the time, okay, or people involved with it. This was unusual. I found this. They had a cage ball teams of the Lincoln Museum, the Wax Museum, Hall of Presidents, okay, the Diorama, the Dobbin House, right? They had a cage teams there, okay? Now, I had to look up what cage teams, there were big balls, right? It's a very unusual game. It lasted, I guess, into the 60s, and that was it. It was developed in the 1920s, but I thought that was kind of funny. Listen, things getting stolen out of wax museums are so common. Things in the exhibits, people climb over the edge and go in and grab this or a souvenir out of the museum. Well, they stole the flags off the front of the museum, okay? And they chased the guy, and he dropped them on Highland Avenue. I'm not sure where that is, but I guess it's close enough there. There's Mr. Beam. They hit 1 million people by 1966, okay? So they were pretty much going through there pretty quickly. Now, who went through we all went through there, right? Relics, again, a sword and a carbine for $50 each were stolen. This is 1966, so there you go. Somebody walked in there and got out with it. There's where Saunders was in the museum originally, but they redid him, I guess, or emphasized him because of his anniversary with the Grange, the creation of the Grange in Washington. I threw this guy in there. This is a local man that lives in John McFerrin, who lived in, was it Littlestown? Is that right? Littlestown? Anyway, he worked for Dorfman, and so he was making waxing. He might have made some stuff for this museum. He ended up becoming the last manager of the Natural Bridge Wax Museum. Whoa, gosh darn it. Okay, souvenirs, very important, muy importante. Okay, this is one of Uberman's bags, but what's really funny about it is take a look at the bottom. You see that? Gettysburg Civil War souvenirs, 300-seat cafeteria that never got built, okay? There was a giant 500-seat cafeteria in Washington, D.C. That's why they thought they were going to build one here, too, and I think it's probably because it's money, I'm guessing. Okay? What did come, though, in 69 was Big Boy, okay? So there's Elby's on the left. Eventually, he's changed to Shoney's. Uberman was an investor in that company that ran... at least Shoney's. I was sure it was probably Elby's too, because they were essentially the same group. Okay, and there they are at the dedication. They're going to break ground. And who was the biggest visitor they had? Maybe Mamie, 1972. There's a letter from her. It's right up here if you want to see it. So Mamie's letter that she wrote to our good friends at the Wax Museum. I want to tell you how enjoyable our visit was with you yesterday, how impressed Julie and I were with your exhibitions. We deeply appreciate the fact you had us as your guests. Sincerely, Mamie. Okay? So that was probably the most famous person they ever had there. Now, we're getting into, think about Disney, what's going on with him. Animatronics, right? He starts, of course, with Mr. Lincoln, Disney does, for the Illinois exhibit at New York World's Fair 64, 65. So by 74, Earl's thinking, what can we do to make this a little more lively? So they create a animated Lincoln for that final scene. There's a brochure for it, and it was created in 1974, and there he is. It's a new Lincoln. Obviously, he's not moving because I have video of it, but that's him. Fully dimensional animated figure. So that was added a little more pizzazz to what's going on here. Now, just to explain a little bit, here's Weavertown. That is now a gift shop or a flower store and an antique store out there at this facility here. I show you these pictures because it relates directly to Lincoln, because Dorfman built this one too with several moving figures in this schoolhouse. Okay, see the wiring here? Okay, this is after the museum closed. I called up the young couple who bought the building and said, can I come out and take pictures before you take it apart? And so I did that. And they also gave me some things, including the tapes from that facility as well that we, anyway, I couldn't get. Anyway, here's the basement now. See all that wiring and stuff on the motors up? That's all to make those things work, okay? All sorts of pneumatic things going on here, equipment. They're all named, that's Jonas, the student up there, right? That's the one student that moves. Earl Dorfman told me they had a guy like almost there every week to fix this because it was always breaking down. It's really hard to maintain it, you know? And of course, who we ended up with Lincoln later on was James Gettys, right? That was the video of him. That was the last version of that the museum actually used, okay, was him, which was a good idea because it gave it more, again, more pizzazz, more animation. This is a case where, unfortunately, the Ubermans and the Dorfmans fell apart from each other, and it was a whole legal battle for several years, I think like 7 years, over the figures, because what happened was the figures were provided by Dorfman's Dorothy Lynch Company. They were essentially rented to the museum. And when the ownership started changing over the years, there was arguments over how much money had to be paid, and it all went through, they say the Supreme Court. I don't think it ever got to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it went to a U.S. Superior Court, but I don't think it ever made it to the Supreme Court. But in any case, the Ubermans lost the case, and I think what happened was after that, they just agreed that the Ubermans would buy out the figures themselves and whatever. I think that's my construction of what happened, is my guess. And remember I told you in 1993, well, the Glory movie came out, they repopulated that exhibit. Remember it had the proclamation in the back? Now I've got a nice scene and more figures, okay? So they tried to update that. Here's an important one, because of course we all know the story of the visitor center and how that whole area right there all was very much around the cyclorama, the tiny visitor center, and the Rosenstiel building, right? They're all within walking distance of each other. When they decide to move away, this creates all sorts of problems. And Eric Uberman, who was Chaim's son, became the owner of the company, and it got quite a bit of attention back in 1999 before the actual new facility was built for the Park Service and stuff. It was a really big deal here. Now, Tim lived here then, so he can tell us maybe in a moment what it was like back then. But there was something, they were taking photos of the Wax Museum for the Park Service, and they're like, why are you taking pictures of my museum? What is going on here, you know? So anyway, that got involved in, a lawsuit with them. I threw this in here because it's kind of, it just shows you how integral the Wax Museum was to the Prince of Peace. It was integral to Shoney's. It was integral to the Gettysburg Tour Site. They all work together like they do today to some extent, right? To try to make this desirable for people to come. So as collectively, they're able to really offer up a really nice thing for people to visit. The Lincoln Train Museum up on the top. So, and of course, again, the Quality Inn is right across the street. They hit 40 years. They put a nice little park in there, okay? They actually, what I didn't show in here, but they actually put a gigantic, for the bicentennial, put a gigantic flag in that area out there, to basically be very patriotic. And it's ironic we're talking about patriotism on Steinway, right? So they did that back in the day, but they put a nice little park in there, and that exists to this day. So if you go to the Heritage Center, that little sort of foresty area right to the right of the front entrance, that's from back then. They changed the name of the museum in 2003 from National to American. I assume that had something to do with, so that people distinguish between the other Dorfman museums, perhaps. This is an interesting article I found, and it really, it's the whole thing here. Now, to me, Tim is the absolute expert on just about everything, but for me, I'm really interested in this whole commercialization thing and the balance between the park and the businesses that are here. And this guy, Walter Jones, wrote this really interesting article, and I just mention it because he points out that the Park Service, to a great extent, was like lashing back at these local businesses here that are bringing people in. And he's like, listen, they carried the story of Gettysburg long before you did, a lot of these places, in a more interesting format, including Rosenstiel, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that still, that was in the same time when the Park Service wasn't going to put Rosenstiel's big images on the wall down there too, and it was their collection, for God's sake. So anyway, you could see how the Wax Museum got involved in some of these things. Whoops, gosh, I keep doing that. And Tim alerted me to this. The reason this is a new one in the 2000, I don't know when it went in, but was another exhibit put in there, and it was Lincoln at the Wills House, okay? And Tim thought that the primary reason for it is because, as you know, children running through a museum run way ahead of the parents. And so it's sort of, because this is right before you get into the battle room at the end there, okay? So they thought maybe that might sort of slow them down a little bit. It's one more exhibit. Here's, again, now we've done through the years, we're going to do some other things quick. Here's some brochures. Notice Wax Works, Wax Museum, okay? So they were transitioning, getting away from it. Audio, all the audio tapes came out of the Civil War Wax Museum, the cassette tapes and stuff. They were selling those for years. There were other businesses as well across the street that were doing it, but they were one of the big ones here. There's the gift shop that the Ubermans ran right there, okay? Here's one of the later ones right before they closed. Okay, the souvenirs. There's the one I showed at the beginning here, the red one. The one in the black, the author of that book is sitting right over there. He rewrote this book to correct some mistakes and to update it and what have you. So, unfortunately, I couldn't find my other copy that doesn't have the big sticker on it because they gave those out at the auction. So, some souvenirs I didn't bring. This is actually kind of at an angle here. That's a picnic table for you to take to your picnic table where you put your ketchup and your mustard in and stuff like that. They had tons of wood. Uberman had tons of wood things that went to all the museums. All they do is stamp a different name on each one, right? I brought that. There's a little deer over there, a little coin box for a child. A couple of the pennants I brought with me. There's the coloring book that they came out toward the end. There's actually one of the original tickets from the museum. I bid on that turnstile and I did not get it. I so wanted that turnstile for my own little museum, but I did not get it. It went way too high. Some postcards. There's a souvenir album, the one that flips out on the top. Okay, everybody ate buttermints in the 1960s, okay? This is super rare. This container that's in there, I defy you to find another one, okay? But we're not to the actual holy grail of souvenirs you get. That's the ultimate souvenir, the snow globe. I only know of two of them. One is mine and one's on Worth Point. Somebody else bought it. So anyway, it's a little miniature building there. So this is making Tim upset now because he's seeing stuff that, it's hard for him to get. So. Okay, spring of 2013, they decide they're going to sell the museum. Okay, they put up for sale 12,450 square feet of museum. That's right before the 150th anniversary, so this is one of my photographs. I came myself for it because I realized the museum's going to close. I want to go one more time. I'm going to come on July 3rd, that week. And so, yes, I was a participant on the southern side. I was with Armistead, and that group, these a bunch of guys from Virginia and I, a New Jersey guy, went across the field, of course. There we go. We're on our way now. Okay, there's all the Union officers waiting for us on the other side. And this is some photos from that visit that week of July 3rd, 2013. There's Jeff Shara signing books inside. Notice how it looks different today with the gift shop, okay? Okay, much different now, all right? Much different. I don't know what she's saying. Why are you taking pictures in here? Because I'm going to do a program in 2025, okay? So that's why. Okay, the last visit, I'm just going to run through some. Notice some of these figures have moved, right? They were both in the cart before, now one's out, right? That's always fun about this stuff. Bob Dorfman told me when he went to visit his father in Washington, he went in the exhibits because he loved playing with kids a little bit. He wouldn't be really crazy. He would just wink at a kid, and the kid would go running back to his parents. There's a guy's winking in there, and he would just sit there like this, and stuff. So, okay, so notice where people are moving here too, right? There's Preston Brooks. Okay, hitting Charles Sumner. This, if you remember, I told you before, there were several pre-Civil War congressmen and stuff that were all those black and white photos. This is what replaced that. This is the Underground Railroad exhibit, okay? And so they got some more figures. They moved people around. They took out all Harry Beecher Stowe, Lloyd Garrison, Rhett, all those people. They took them out and recreated this. And I don't know exactly when it happened. That I don't know. There's the front door. They're knocking, of course, and the slaves are the the escaped slaves are going down into the basement. Okay. They added some names now too. Notice they put some little tabletop names. Okay. Again, this was the last visit I had. Now notice Jenny Wade now is in a little bit more of a kitchen here. It's got wallpaper on it and stuff like that. Okay. Here's some shots, and you didn't really see this, but this is bright in there with my flash, but those are normally just pretty dark, and so the exhibits themselves are the emphasis, right? There's the carbine on the floor. That was sold by the horse soldier during that auction, by the way. It went pretty well, I think. Went for over 3,000 or 4,000, I think. And there's I guess as a child, it's small, but she's freaking out over there on the right? So she's pretty upset about what's going on here. Again, just some looks down the corridors here. Everything's painted black so that, again, it's dark enough to really emphasize the exhibits themselves. Okay? Southern military leaders. There's one of the signs. That lives in Waltham, New Jersey, too. Appomattox is with me now. I got Grant. I did not get Lee. I got Grant, so that sign. couldn't find it to bring with me today. Notice that there's more figures in that scene now. Notice there's paintings on the wall, a whatchamacallit on the right there, a cabinet. Look who's in the back right corner. There he is. That's your man right over there you want to take a picture with before you leave today. Or General Reynolds here too. The key is that the Ubermans were very much involved in Williamsburg and Gatlinburg wax museums too. And so what ended up happening was when those museums closed, a lot of the figures came up here. So when they were doing changes, they could add more figures into the exhibits. So that's why I'm pretty sure he's actually Williamsburg, because I have the archive for Williamsburg, and there's a figure looking through a window. I don't know who he's looking at, but he's looking through a window, and I'm pretty sure it's him. I mean, he's dressed differently, of course, but that was him. Again, some more shots there. There's the Lincoln exhibit. And again, with a flash photography, lighting is really important, color is important, but these guys, they're kind of, sometimes they get very glossy when you do that, so they do the best. Anyway, this is on the way to the battle room. There's that same map. There's the big sign that used to be, that was auctioned off. My wife would not let me bring it in. So, because like I said, I've got 20 figures in my house, in my office. And not all from Gettysburg, though, from all different places. And I would love to have had that. I found out where it went. Actually, Eric Dorr owns it now. But yeah, I would like to have had it. But again, you have to live at home with your wife, right? So you don't want to, you want to be able to. She always tells me, you go into a wax thing, no more figures. I go, no more figures, okay? There's the final scene, when I took it in July of 2013. That's when it's still fully populated, okay? There's Reynolds right there. Notice he has feet and both arms. He does not have them here with you, and I'll explain why in a minute. There's the Sickles exhibit. He moved into the Gettysburg Heritage Center, right? There's Warren now. And now Warren's got, he's got his pistol, but it's down now, okay? Now, what happens? This is July 2013. Right after this, the museum shuts down for what it will be its last days, basically. And so they auction off pretty much everything. So all the exhibits, except this one, they actually auction off all the exhibits except for this one and only parts of this one. And that's going to explain why he is the way he is today. They wanted to preserve this for the Gettysburg Heritage Center, which I appreciate them doing. As a wax guy, I appreciate that. So they kept that there. Here's the auction. Here's who you know. Here's my cousin sitting over here. What's the deal with this guy in the far left, man? He's freaking out about something. I don't know what it is. He's got his mouth wide open there. I don't know. That's me bidding on Grant there, I think. This is from the Gettysburg Times. Here's the auction itself. He came in that back door I showed you before. Is where you signed up. Randy Dickens Sheets ran that auction. The one for Hall of Presidents, Charlie Weaver, and did another one at the Eisenhower Center for a museum from Georgia that they brought the figures up for. I did a couple heads, no figure. She let me buy a couple heads, though. I got a bunch of heads, too. So that's where all the money is in the heads. There's my cousin here with is that Burnside there? Is that Burnside? I think it is. Anyway. Yeah. Here's the debris pile in the back that they were selling in groups, okay? Notice that all the extra boots and the arms and stuff, some of them got numbers on them because they were all from, again, not just Gettysburg, from the other wax museums that got mixed in here. So all these heads, there are heads in here that were not, like the one in the upper right. I don't know if that's Washington or not, but he was not in the Gettysburg Wax Museum. It's just that he came from Williamsburg or Gatlinburg, one of the two, probably Williamsburg. Right, plenty of heads with blood on them, all sorts of stuff. There's Andrew Jackson. Now, he was probably the one that was in there originally. There's the turnstile number 265 I did not get. I wish I had it, but I did not get it. Somebody else owns it. All the props were sold, right? The most expensive prop, by the way, that day was that Singer sewing machine in the Northern exhibit. That went for over $5,000. I guess it was pretty rare, whatever it was. And again, the Dorfmans tried to put stuff in that was close to representing what it would be. Here's a Dred Scott. Notice there's more stuff in that exhibit now. There he is now. Again, he's saying, I'm on my way to Walton, New Jersey now. Okay, so that's where he is. Here's a figure. Now, notice on top here that, and I'll get close to it here, notice Doctor's Helper number 20, or number 2, sickle scene. So they purposely did that. So, because, I mean, you're dealing with hundreds of figures here to kind of keep track of. They wrote in magic marker at the base of the head what it was going to, so they kept track of all of it. My cousin ended up buying those ribbons on the original medical officer, corpsman stripes there. Where did they get all the stuff from? They got it from costume companies, particularly in Baltimore. They went to these places. A lot of these places had original stuff there. And so that guy, the Screamer, he's got revenue cutter service, right? Buttons on there. And so my cousin bought the coat, I bought him. So he lives with me, and my cousin has the coat, okay? There he is, freaking out. He's a Screamer, okay? Again, I ended up with number 2. I did not end up with number 1. He needs a hair thing. There's a bunch of the paintings that they sold that have been done and added to the museum over the years. Here's, again, how'd that get in there? Oh, there's an extra couple slides there. The Ubermans added additional backgrounds, and this was one of them. It's kind of funny, actually, but that was the one for the Charles Sumner exhibit. All the books, all the props got sold. Now, this explains the story of why he's missing his legs, I think, and why he's missing one arm. When they took him out, here he is, but what exhibit did they put him with? John Reynolds. They put him with Clara Barton. They took the other figure out and put him in there. So I knew it was Reynolds. So I said, I'm getting that figure. And so what happened was, and see that I have that blanket, that bloody blanket at home. What they did is they wanted, I think, bloody parts to use for the sickles exhibit or the amputation exhibits in the current Heritage Center. So there's an exhibit you go through, it's like a tent, and they're doing an amputation, and there's a bunch of legs and arm stuff. That's where a lot of those came from, that final battle scene. Okay, here's your friend over here. Who's looking at him? Yes, a very angry Native American who came from Plymouth, okay? A guy who walked into the Pilgrims and handed them a snake skin and a bow and arrow, which was a message from Massasoit and all the Indians up there. Not the Narragansets, the Wampanoags. So anyway, that's where he lives there too now. He comes out at Thanksgiving every once in a while, and I've got a few Plymouth people who come out at Thanksgiving. There's Grant. Here he's in my office. He's behind him over there. I don't want to show you my office. It's too messy. There he is. He comes out for holidays. This is my wife's friend. We went to a decoration Memorial Day event, and I thought, wouldn't it be appropriate to have a Confederate soldier there with the Appomattox sign, okay, for Memorial Day. So I brought him out. What the heck? Have some fun. And there she is at the top of the stairs. There's Jenny Wade inside Eric Doerr's Museum of History there, Gettysburg Museum of History. That's where she is. And her sign is with her too. See, the sign's up there with her too. So we end up with the Heritage Center, and one of the key people in the Heritage Center is Tim Smith. He helped them redesign that using some of the older figures, but redesign the concept of what they're going to talk about, talking a lot about the battle, the civilian role in the battle before and after, that kind of concept. So here they are, they're transitioning now, see, over, and look at the gift shop now, it's all beautiful, right? And they did so much nice work in there. Here's the final battle scene. Now they have, again, probably 20 figures probably got taken out of there, including Reynolds. The Civil War Trust gave them a film to show instead of the Lincoln thing, so that's how that changed, okay? And that's kind of what it was, or kind of what it is now even, at the facility. Of course, they use a nice thing we do as being a fire professor. We actually advocate museums used audio to show exit signs, not just those above the door, but use things like that, which is a really good idea. And so that's the end. Who's that Earl? He put himself as a sleeping painter in all the museum. He'd be in a corner. There was motion detectors that when you walk by, you hear like this and stuff. And of course, people, it's funny because he was a funny guy.